In the name of God, the compassionate and merciful, hello everyone, and welcome to the new episode of the Fact series in which we discuss international political matters every week. This is Foad Mahdavi, and in this episode, I have the honor of being the host of Eric Walberg, a journalist specializing in the Middle East, Central Asia, and Russia from Canada. We are here to discuss the U.S. withdrawal from the region and the role of Iran. Thank you for joining us, and good to be with you. For the first stride, I'd like to ask you, in general, how do you assess U.S. foreign policy in the region?
U.S. foreign policy in the region? Well, it's a disaster from any rational point of view. It is serving to create chaos, to keep countries weak and divided, and subservient to Israel. So that's the main goal of U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East at present. And it's the cause of unending war and tragic disaster for Palestinians and Syrians and Iraqis. And farther afield, you could go right to Afghanistan. The U.S. everywhere is playing a very negative role in world politics.
Okay, if you would like to expand your words about the U.S. foreign policy history in the region, how do you describe its deep structure?
Well, this really dates back to the 19th century when Britain was the world hegemon. And it orchestrated its policies in the Middle East to suit its imperial agenda, which was to make Britain the world hegemon using Israel or Palestine. There was no word for Israel at that point as a nation. So they would just consider Palestine, but it would be a Jewish Palestine. And that is the same policy that continues today. There have been developments, of course. Saudi Arabia became important and became a major oil producer. But the U.S. was right there in the 1930s, right from the start of the expansion of Saudi oil in the world. The U.S. was there in a controlling force. And then when Britain took over Palestine in the 1920s, it proceeded to implement this policy of bringing Jews in to create a Western subservient, a Western nation state in the region. They didn't. There was no attempt to give the Arabs real independence. And this has been for 100 years, basically this same policy to keep Arabs divided, weak, corrupt regimes that are subservient to the U.S., no longer to Britain, but to the U.S. So it's one long, very sad, very unpleasant history that the Middle East has had because of this imperial agenda.
Regarding to the current circumstances, the question is whether or not the U.S. military can withdraw from the region. Go ahead.
Yes, when you asked me to talk about the U.S. withdrawal, I have to put quotation marks around that word because it will never withdraw until it collapses, until somehow it is pushed out. Iran was able to push out the Western forces, but it took a revolution, an Islamic revolution, to carry that out. And that possibility has been squashed wherever it arises. Egypt had a similar kind of revolution, but it was much less secure, with the military still subservient to the West, so that collapsed. So this is basically the situation just continues, and as long as the U.S. is hegemon in the world, it will always have bases in the Middle East. The big question in my mind is Afghanistan, which had expelled foreign troops and foreign foreigners from controlling the country, but this only lasted for about 6 years, 5 or 6 years in the 90s. And then the U.S. invaded it. Even before 9/11, it was planning to invade Afghanistan because it refused to allow a country, especially close to Iran, to carry out a similar kind of process of expelling the foreigners. Now, after 20 years, the U.S. is basically saying it will withdraw. It told the Taliban that we will withdraw, and it has scaled back its troops. But now it's left with a puppet government that refuses to abide by the treaty or the peace treaty that the U.S. signed with the Taliban. So if that's not going to happen, then the U.S. troops will not leave. They will not allow their puppet regime to collapse quite so simply. So I'm doubtful that U.S. troops will finally leave Afghanistan in the short run. Of course, with world crises like coronavirus and who knows what the U.S. will be doing in Venezuela or against Iran, or who knows with Syria, it's still not finished, and Iraq is in a mess. So I don't see the possibility that any of these crises where U.S. troops are present, that the U.S. will just leave. Trump tried to leave Syria a year and a half ago, and he was immediately accused of undermining U.S. foreign policy, and the troops didn't leave. So this idea that the U.S. will withdraw, that's something that is written down on paper, but it's worthless because it's not carried out in fact, at least to this point.
You mean that it is impossible?
Well, we have to keep struggling. It's incredible that Syria has survived this long, and that it is basically holding the U.S. to a stalemate. The U.S. and Turkey that want to have more control over who governs Syria. But that hasn't happened. So where Russia finds its interests are being served, it will back up resistors like Bashar Assad in Syria. But we can't be sure even of support. The only principled actor in all of this is Iran, and it is under heavy sanctions. I wake up every day worrying about Iran and what the U.S. and Israel are planning to do. So it's not a comfortable position to be in, but I think if Iran does hold steady, that the issues of Syria, Afghanistan, all of these issues will keep playing out against the interests of the U.S.'s hegemony. They will basically have to comply with international law in the long run. We can't be sure when, but we have to keep fighting and pursuing the just path and pursuing the truth in this matter.
Okay, I have another question in this case. How effective do you think the assassination of General Soleimani is in shaping up the wave of U.S. withdrawal from the region?
Well, that was outrageous, but then the U.S. is doing so many outrageous things internationally and breaking all conceivable laws with Russia, with China, with Iran. It's really hard to imagine that the U.S. has descended into such a chaotic state with Trump. And what the assassination of General Soleimani really, it was like throwing down the gauntlet to Iran, saying, we are at war with you. That was an act of war. So the U.S. is basically emboldened to pursue war with Iran, and who knows who else. So I don't think it's solved. It really just emphasized the way the U.S. Operates in a totally distrustful way. That's all that assassination really accomplished. And unless Iraq moves against the U.S., which is unlikely to do with it's got lots of U.S. troops, its economy is basically run by Western corporations. Iraq isn't really in a position to carry out its own threat to expel the troops. That again was on paper, but the reality is sadly very different.
You know, the United States still thinks that supporting authoritarian regimes in the region, unquestioning support for Israel, and talking about leadership can be the key to Middle East management. But this approach has lost its capacity. Do you agree?
It's lost. Well, it's a big tyrant. It's not. It looks weak, but it's still huge, and it's got massive arms, and it's got a huge military, far in excess of any other country. So these elements within the U.S. will keep it functioning as hegemon, and will keep it even without Trump, which will reduce the tensions with Iran. But in terms of the other issues, there will be no real change with Biden. So I don't see a bright light on the horizon at this point. We just have to be firm and resolute.
You know, just imagine that the U.S. withdrawal from the region comes through, okay? What are the possible consequences of the U.S. withdrawal from the region? Are there any consequences? What do you think?
Well, that's a wonderful idea that the U.S. would withdraw. Let's say it withdrew from Afghanistan. Well, I really think the Taliban will come back to power. And I hope that they will be able to work with Iran, that they are both Islamic states. I hope that even though there are differences between the Taliban's beliefs and the way they function and Iran's, I think there should be a common ground that they can, and that would allow the rebuilding of Afghanistan. And a country like China and Russia, they can be much more help than the U.S. If the U.S. Claims it wants to help rehabilitate, I don't think that any country should be beholden to the U.S. on those issues. Because really, if the people are working together, and you don't need a huge amount of fancy modern technology to rebuild the economy to a modest scale where people are fed and where they can feel safe. Those are things the Taliban can do without any major external intervention, and they can find their own allies. So if that's the case, then I can't see how the U.S. can continue to victimize Iran. That whole policy against Iran will also collapse. So that's where I'm looking, hopefully, that if the Taliban can prevail and force the U.S. troops out, and then start working with countries to rebuild. And the same goes with Syria. If they can force those, there aren't a lot of U.S. troops there, and a lot of them have left. So it's not outside the realm of possibility that Syria will also get rid of its U.S. troops. Then we will have a much different situation. Iraq will not be in the same straits as well. So eventually that could result in a whole movement of peace right across the Middle East. with Iran at one end, and Pakistan, and Afghanistan, and then moving through as far as Syria and Turkey. That's what we have to aim for, and we have to keep pursuing to the U.S. to get its troops out and to keep after that. Eventually, they will go. I mean, 1,000 years ago, the Crusades, for 100 years, they victimized and terrorized the Middle East and slaughtered Christians and Jews, and it was horrible. And eventually, they were forced to leave, and it was the Muslims that pushed them out. So I think that we have to just keep the Crusades in mind as the negative example that we have to prevail against. And this is a modern crusade.
You said something about Taliban and the role of Taliban in this case. Don't you think that Taliban as well as Daesh was fabricated by the U.S.?
Well, no, that's not fair to say about the Taliban. That I've written about this and researched it quite, and I also lived in Uzbekistan, and I've been following Afghanistan very closely. And the Taliban were a grassroots organization. There was no one. They were basically the intellectual, the mullah elements within the Mujahideen. Mujahideen were just really a mixed lot of just adventurers. Some of them were sincere, generally poorly educated, but out of the chaos of the mid-90s, the Taliban arose as really a credible. I think it's very it's very Salafist. It's not really. It's not like the ISIS. They are not good friends with ISIS. It's my understanding that they would like to get rid of ISIS too. What do they need ISIS for? They're not exporting revolution. They are basically a homegrown political organization.
How do you see these variations in the Middle East? Will it move actually towards growth and prosperity?
That's in the eyes of the beholder. If you get rid of the U.S. troops, that will be such. If we get rid of the U.S. troops, that alone will be such a blessing for all of the people that are suffering under them now. So that will raise people's spirits, and hopefully there will be credible leaders that arise and that can work with the Syrian government, with Iraq, with Afghanistan. That there will be people that arise out of their own people without being pushed in or flown in by the U.S. as it did in Afghanistan. It flew in Afghan expats that were living in the U.S. and Canada, and they gave them jobs as mayor of Kandahar, and even Al-Ghani. He was just an American professor, and they flew him in and set him up as the president, and it's disastrous. So get rid of those people, and that will be the beginning of a new Middle East. That's what we really have to focus on. Get rid of the U.S. troops. And of course, we've still got Israel there, but eventually, if the U.S. troops are gone, and it will be easier to deal with Israel if the U.S. is not if it's not showing its presence so aggressively as it is now.
How do you assess Iran's role in the guiding regional variations?
Yes, that's a very good question, and Iran really is showing itself as honorable and reliable. For instance, with Venezuela, it was able to send 5 tankers of gasoline, which sounds a bit it's like sending coals to Newcastle. But in fact, Venezuela, its whole oil industry has collapsed due to the sanctions and due to U.S. interference and encouraging Venezuelans to leave, to come to the U.S., just as they did with Cuba. Traditionally, they let Cubans, any Cuban at all, come and will set you up in the U.S. That's what the U.S. has been doing now with Venezuela, to undermine the Venezuelan government. And Iran stood by Venezuela, and that's a sign that other countries like Russia and China should stop kowtowing to the U.S. And to start to honor their commitments and to support their true allies. So Iran is playing a very important role as an example to other countries. It takes great courage for Iran to do what it's doing, and it's gone ahead and done that. So that is really the main focus of Iran. Also, it's important that Iran has been able to cross the Atlantic from one side of the world to the other without the U.S. sinking its ships or without being blockaded and forced to retreat. It moved ahead. It didn't blink when it was looking at the ogre in the eyes, and the ogre backed down and let it pass. So that is, I think that is really the main role at this point for Iran, is as an example for other countries, and to not back down against the U.S. and its threats.
At the end, if you want to add something more, I'm all ears.
Well, let's hope that the U.S. citizens will wake up and not re-elect this Trump. He really has been a disaster for really virtually everyone. And so Iran is in good company when it's being victimized by this tyrant. And I'm very hopeful that things will improve if we get rid of Trump.
Thank you for joining us again, and goodbye. Dear audience, it was another talk with Eric Walberg, a journalist specializing in the Middle East, Central Asia, and Russia from Canada, about the U.S. withdrawal from the region and the role of Iran. Thank you for watching, and catch you later.